Charles Schultz, Will Eisner, Jack Kirby, Harvey Kurtzman, R. Crumb, Art Spiegelman, Chester Gould, Milton Caniff. These individuals, I would like to think, were ones who, when they drew their artwork, they kept their artwork and not more or less let it with the individuals who owned, who published through a syndicate or through a publishing company, the artwork. And I know that Bob Andelman, author of this magnificent book on Will Eisner, A Spirited Life, I know, Bob Andelman, that's the one thing Will had fought for, primarily because of the fact that if you drew the piece, then you should be entitled to have residuals for it. Whereas the publishing companies thought otherwise. They basically more or less treated it as, am I right in saying a sweatshop existence?
Yeah, and what's interesting is that Will believed in ownership before he knew what the value of that ownership would be. And yet, when he was running a studio, whether it was with Jerry Iger or later with Busy Arnold, the people who worked for him did not own the rights to their work, but Will always owned the rights to his work. It's kind of an interesting paradox there that, in retrospect, I wish I had gotten into more in the book. But yeah, and he always encouraged people in later years, once he was out of the studio situation, to create things and keep their rights. But the comic book artists and writers notoriously, really up until, maybe the last 15 or 20 years, just did not do that.
Yeah. In fact, I think that was the one deciding factor that made him not accept Stan Lee's offer to take over Marvel Comics in the early 70s, when Stan basically wanted to head west to Hollywood and make movies.
Yeah, and there's that whole chapter in the book about that. That was, Will had mentioned that to me in passing. We did interviews over at least 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, and we would talk either on the phone each week or we would meet each week. And sometimes he would just say things that he figured everybody knew, or it didn't matter to him. And one day he said to me, well, there was that time, of course, that, Stan Lee wanted me to take over Marvel Comics. And after I picked my jaw up from the floor, I said, I'm sorry, excuse me, could you say that again?
Yeah.
And so he told me, he says, I don't remember too much about it. And I thought, well, that's not going to be too hard to track down. I'll just call Stan. And Stan was like, I don't really remember that. And I said, well, okay, here's what Will said. He says, well, I'm not going to argue with Will Eisner. So he said, you ought to call Roy Thomas and ask Roy. Roy will remember. And I called Roy, and yeah, he did remember. And then Roy said, you ought to talk to Marv Wolfman. He'll remember. And sure enough, all these other little stories about it came up. And it was amazing. But to come back to what you're saying, Will went down to meet with Stan at Stan's request. Stan didn't exactly tell him what it was about. Will thought, well, maybe he just wants me to come down and talk to him about doing some work for Marvel, which he had already decided he wasn't going to do. But, as a courtesy, he went down. And this was about, I'm trying to remember, somewhere between 72 and 74. Yeah. I think I pinpointed a little more closely in the book than I can recall off the top of my head. And so he went down and talked to him, and then Stan drops this bomb. I want to go out to the West Coast and get more involved with movies. That's really where my heart is now. But I can't leave unless there's somebody to take over Marvel. And you've got the business sense, and you've got the comic book experience. You'd be perfect. Now, Will had pretty much been out of the industry, for generally 20 years. He'd, come in a little bit here and there. So he said, well, if I were to do this, I would want the artists and the writers to get the rights to their work, and I'd want them to be compensated, and I want them to get their art returned, and I'd want this and that. And Stan's like, oh, they'll never agree to that. He's aghast. Not that he personally may have been opposed to that, but it was his uncle Martin Goodman who ran Marvel, which was Timely, which was Atlas, and he would never have gone along with that. The industry would have just killed him, and it would never have happened at the time.
Exactly. If you want to read more about this, and I know we're running out of time, and I apologize for this, but it's always best to say, if you want to know more, get the book Will Eisner, A Spirited Life, written by Bob Andelman. It's out from M-Press. Check out the website, mpress.com. By the way, it was 1972. Interestingly enough, Stan Lee and Bob Kane also went to the same high school as Will Eisner, DeWitt Clinton High School, interestingly enough. Bob Andelman, your website is Andelman, ANDELMAN.com, and we will see you this coming weekend at MegaCon in Orlando. Orlando, thanks so much for being with us on Sci-Fi Overdrive.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
It's an honor, sir. It's an honor. Check out our website, sci-fioverdrive.com. Stay with us.